Welcome to Intercoin, making crypto mainstream.
Hey everyone, I'm here with Ian Clarke. He is the founder and original inventor of Freenet, one of the first, if not maybe the first major decentralized system. Now, of course, we had, IRC and we had all these protocols back in the day, which were able to be sort of decentralized, but they still required servers and they still required these privileged machines. And I think today we're seeing almost like distributed to the edges networks, which are highly resilient. And one of the first ones, I think, was Freenet. So with that, I want to kind of ask you, Ian, introduce yourself and talk about how did you come up with this originally?
Absolutely, yeah. So as you said, my name is Ian Clarke. I originally came up with the idea for Freenet. I was studying computer science and artificial intelligence at the University of Edinburgh in Scotland, and I was really interested in two kind of different things. One of which was kind of more philosophical, was the question of freedom of speech on the internet. I was at university in the mid to late 90s, and during that time when people talked about the internet, they would say things like, oh, it roots around censorship. And there was this idea that it was this bastion of free speech. And as I was studying computer science and learning about how the internet technology worked, it became fairly obvious to me that in many ways, it was almost the opposite. The internet had the potential to be the most easily monitored and censored communication medium yet invented. And so I kind of started to think about that really as a technical problem. What makes the internet easy to censor, and what could we do about it technically? And then at the same time, I was studying artificial intelligence, studying kind of a lot of different things. And one thing that really caught my attention was this idea called emergent systems. And emergent systems, you actually see throughout nature. An emergent system is any time where you get a lot of simple components and allow them to interact with each other, they exhibit sophisticated behavior on a large scale. So examples in nature would include something like an ant colony. Each individual ant is pretty dumb. They've got, maybe 900 neurons, depending on the ant. But when you take hundreds or thousands of ants, put them together in a colony, they can defend themselves, they can find food, they can reproduce, they exhibit all of the sophisticated behavior. Another example in nature would be a flock of birds. Each bird in a flock is following a fairly simple set of rules. Don't bump into another bird, try to stay in the middle, that type of thing. But even through following those simple rules, birds exhibit this very sophisticated flocking behavior. So I was thinking about these two ideas, and it slowly dawned on me that if you were going to build a system or a layer on top of the internet that would allow people to publish and consume information without fear of censorship, emergent systems actually have all of the properties that you would want in a system like that. They're decentralized. There's no kind of bird out at the front of the flock saying, hey guys, go left, hey guys, go right. Similarly with ants, there is a queen ant, but the queen ant isn't literally telling all the other ants what to do. And these are all in a censorship-proof system. You need something that's going to be decentralized, because any kind of centralization is a potential point of control. It also needs to be very survivable. So again, going back to the nature examples, if you were kind of mean and you took out your shotgun and started shooting at a flock of birds and you hit a couple of them, the flock's not going to suddenly, I mean, they'll probably disperse for safety, but they're not suddenly going to stop being able to flock. And similarly, if you've ever had an ant infestation, you can kill ants, all day, all night, but the ant colony isn't going to suddenly stop doing its thing. And so I started to think about how would you build a system that was based on these emergent principles that would sit as a layer on top of the internet, allowing people to both publish and consume information without fear of censorship. And that was kind of the genesis of it.
So I love it. I mean, you've talked about the philosophical underpinnings of what you're building. On this show, we like to get into the details of things. So we're going to talk about the technology as well as the sort of socio-political issues of freedom of speech, right? Because there's people on all sides of the issues and so on. It's funny, I remember growing up, there was this program called Boids, B-O-I-D-S. Each bird, it had a simulation of birds, and each bird had simple rules, and it looked like a flock of birds flying around.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
So that, yeah, I remember that. The thing is, a lot of stuff that we see today has been funded by venture capitalists in the beginning who buy shares, and then later they go ahead and exit, and they have an IPO and they hand it off to Wall Street. Mm-hmm. And once in a while it goes the other way, like when Elon Musk takes Twitter private, mm-hmm. But typically it goes this way. But regardless of which way it goes, these platforms are typically owned by people with a vested interest to make sure that these platforms do not stop extracting rents and creating profits, right? Because that's the only way that their shares are going to be worth what they're worth and not going to go down. In fact, they want them to go up. So everything these companies do, whether it's Uber or Facebook or anything, it comes with a price. So Uber takes 50% of all the drivers' revenues. And I speak to the drivers when I, take an Uber, and they say, yeah, if you had an open source platform marketplace, which only took 10%, of course, I would just switch over to that. And I'm almost shocked by how readily they're all saying they would do that. And one would think it's so easy to just do that. Why do you think very few projects have arisen to challenge Facebook, Uber, LinkedIn in their respective spheres? Why isn't the world full of open source, shall we say, Web 2.0? It's been 15 years. Like, how come no one has really created a successful competitor to these guys?
Well, I think that's a great question. I think there are a couple of things. I would say in my view, the perfect system is entirely decentralized. So there's no form of centralization ever. And that was very much the goal of the original Freenet, and it's the goal of my new project, Locutus, which you could think of as a reimagining of Freenet for 2022 instead of 1999 when I came up with the original Freenet design. So I think the first part is it's very difficult to build purely decentralized systems, and that's exactly the problem I'm tackling right now with Locutus. But I think that there's also, once you go down the centralization path, I think what we've seen with the various different internet use cases is that it tends to be winner take all. Because particularly something like Uber, network effects play such a significant role. The more drivers you have, the more riders you have, the more riders you can support, the more drivers you can support. And so the bigger the network, the better it works. And if one company controls the network, which is typically the case, then you get this kind of winner take all scenario, or maybe like there's a big winner and then one or kind of a handful of much smaller competitors, which somewhat the case with Uber, definitely the case with search engines and Google, and it's the case with most of these things. You'll get more of a diversity of competition in the early days, much like in the early days of the World Wide Web. There was a bunch of search engines, and for a couple of years it wasn't really clear which one would win. But yeah, I think a lot of it really comes down to engineering is dictating a centralized approach to the architecture, and then network effects kind of ensure a winner takes all outcome.
Right. I think that there are two aspects here from my experience. One is the engineering part. It's just really hard to build a system that is decentralized. I think it's become much more fashionable, but like I like to say, and you say it, and you actually have more cred than I do in this. I say I was into decentralization before it was cool. And you independently told me the same thing when we were talking. I've been into it only since 2010. And first I built, federated things like with a server, but you can run the server out of your house. Okay, so you can have a social network on a plane, you can have a social network on a cruise ship, on a space station, whatever. But then afterwards, people started putting out these things like IPFS, interplanetary file system, and all these other things became cool. And now they have Filecoin. So I'm glad for that. I think the technology is moving in that direction. And we're going to talk about the technology and embarrassingly parallel systems and all this stuff. But the socio-political, I just wanted to spend the first half on the socio-political aspect. And I think the system in which these projects are embedded, and the system in which we live today, is a system where a lot of people don't have safety nets. At least in some countries, they feel a constant running out of money, whether it's for rent, food, or whatever. So they're almost forced to work for an employer, a corporation or something, whether it's to have, in some countries like the United States, you need to work for an employer to even get health insurance given to you. That's not necessarily the case. They have Medicaid for really poor people, but the idea is that the safety net isn't so robust. And so people can't come to their employer and say, I'm going to work 20 hours a week instead of 40 hours because A, I have a family, B, I'm looking to become a scientist in this area or contribute to an open source project or whatever. I think that if projects were funded in this way, like, for example, the DAT project, which is now called HyperCore, was funded by the Knight Foundation. And a lot of these, Apache Foundation, Mozilla Foundation Corporation, a lot of these things help open source, but there isn't really a robust, institution to fund open source as there could be. And I think if there was, then people wouldn't turn to Private Investment by Peter Thiel, who writes a book that's called, 0 to 1. And then he talks about how competition is for losers. You should build a monopoly if you want to, quote, capture value. So the idea of capturing value is very closely tied to recouping investment. But people then recoup the investment, they go further, and they never stop because they sell it to the investors who buy it now at $70, and they don't want their thing to go down back to 30. So there's always this idea that you must maintain control vis-a-vis your users. I just want to say two things about this and then want to hear your thoughts. Mark Zuckerberg wasn't always the guy, because now we have Elon Musk going to be owning Twitter outright with his buddies. And Mark Zuckerberg is a guy who the shareholders cannot remove. He's got the kind of shares where they vote every year to remove him. They can't.
His great-grandchildren will still own Facebook.
Yeah. The question is, will we use it? But yes, so the thing is that Mark Zuckerberg wasn't always like this. He was a cypherpunk nerd type of guy. He made, if people remember, in high school, he made a computer program like Winamp type of audio player. Microsoft offered $1 million to him. And rather than sell it, he just gave it away. He just put it open sourced it, put it out there. Then in college, when he made Facebook, he made it as a college Facebook, okay? And Sean Parker has this story where I remember I was at TechCrunch, the original TechCrunch 2008, and Sean Parker was saying, Mark Zuckerberg wanted to make WireHog, a peer-to-peer file distribution network that was completely encrypted and so on, and decentralized and resilient. And Sean Parker said, we put a bullet in that thing. We. So who is we? Sean Parker wanted to make Napster. He made it centralized. So the music industry went after him because they needed to extract rents and profits from their members. clients. And so they shut down Napster, and he learned that lesson, and he became on team capitalist, meaning venture capitalist. And so he said, basically to Mark, look, Facebook's got to make profits. It can't just have P2P file sharing. Focus on making the centralized thing that's going to extract rents. My point is, Peter Thiel and Sean Parker, right, for various reasons, they say, like, Peter Thiel says he's a libertarian and he says like all these things, but then he goes and makes Palantir for governments and he does all these things. My point is, they're part of the system, or when they weren't part of the system with Sean Parker, the system taught them that they have to be part of the system. So the system produces centralized things. And I think it's not just a matter of technology. It's a matter of, if I have a cool project and I go on GitHub, I want to find a bunch of developers who have an extra 20 hours a week. Like Google gives them their extra 20 hours, but they own that, whatever they create. I want that, but with no corporation giving them. I want them to have a safety net so they're financially independent to actually work on my project because it's cool and not because they have to survive and it's a mercenary type of thing. That's a world that I would like to see, but I don't think that's a world that we currently have all over the place. And so people work because you got investors giving you money that you can then pay them, rather than having this available time that they want to work on Freenet or Locutus or qbix or Intercoin or whatever. That, I think, is a major reason why open source isn't like all over the place killing these proprietary walled gardens. That's what I was going to say.
Yeah, I mean, in some respects, open source has kind of taken over. I mean, Android, which is the most widely deployed operating system in the world, is of course Linux at its core. So in some, Freenet was open source back in 1999, and prior to that, I was very, very much part of the kind of Slashdot subculture of open source, and information wants to be free. And in fact, a lot of the earliest attention that Freenet got came through Slashdot and other kind of websites like that. I agree with you that I think there's a technical motivation to centralize technology. It's just easier to build. But then, of course, there is absolutely then a business motivation, because if it's centralized, then it's a lot easier to kind of put up your toll booth at some point in the value chain in order to capture some value. And this is something I definitely think about a lot in the context of Locutus. We're kind of a mixture of voluntary work and paid work. We fund it primarily through donations that have been made to Freenet over the years. And we've also been fortunate to get a couple of grants over the years from various different companies, including Google. So it comes full circle sometimes. But one of the things I've been giving a lot of thought to, and I don't think I have the answer yet, but I've been thinking a lot about how to fund Locutus, different strategies for funding Locutus. And I've explored things like, cryptocurrency as a funding mechanism. I've also one of the things I think we're going to try is in a decentralized system, it's important to have some kind of source of scarcity. And that it can be for various different reasons. For example, simply preventing spam. So in a decentralized system, let's say you're running your email in a decentralized system, you've got an inbox. How do you prevent people just from filling up your inbox with spam? And the answer, at least an answer, is you have some kind of source of scarcity, which makes it. I'm sorry. Oh yeah, we just.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I would start sharing the screen because I remember Hashcash was a proof of work. The original proof of work wasn't for Bitcoin. The original proof of work was what you're saying, preventing what is called Sybil attacks. So Sybil attacks are named after the movie Sybil, where women claim to have multiple personalities. I mean, I think M. Night Shyamalan made an interesting movie afterwards with the multiple personality dude who has superpowers. But the point is, Sybil attacks are when someone creates multiple accounts. And, you know, now with AI and bots, those accounts can be quite believable. So Elon Musk buys Twitter. He says he's get rid of bots. Good luck. I mean, you're competing against an entire industry of people who eventually will have access to GPT-4, which is an open AI project, I think, a Google project, which can create very convincing and maybe even almost helpful looking text on whatever topic. Of course, the difference is because the people, there is no people behind the bot. There is no flesh and blood thought behind it. The bot has no feelings or morals or anything. They're just simply putting out millions of pieces of content. And that's going to be a scary world. We could go into that at some point. And decentralized systems will produce a lot of things where we might start questioning what is the truth anymore. Because if 99% is done by bots, and they don't have any morals, then the question is, where is the truth in all of that? So there are going to be these massive challenges with that. But, and so I think that proof of work, I was just going to say, was one approach. But proof of work got, like everything else, co-opted by giant mining pools because it becomes profitable in Bitcoin to use proof of work to generate more coins. And so once you create a profit motive again for this, you'll see people go to great lengths. People think, why would you solve a useless problem with the zeros for Bitcoin? Well, because you're going to get a lot of Bitcoin, and because Bitcoin is scarce, it goes up in value. So the mining rewards always go up in value. And so it's almost like creating incentive for people to almost waste resources in order to get this virtual currency. So just every mechanism that we make almost has the potential to be abused somehow, it seems.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, we, in the early days of Freenet, so around about the time that Hashcash was proposed, we explored it and other ideas. And what we ended up going with to address this problem was a web of trust mechanism. So you may remember Web of Trust was originally created, I think in 1991 or 92, as part of a system called Pretty Good Privacy, which was a tool for encrypting and digitally signing email.
Sorry to interrupt, I just want to give a little bit of context. So Pretty Good Privacy, PGP, was done by Phil Zimmerman. This was interesting at the time because the US government considered encryption to be a military sort of thing. And so very strong encryption was actually banned from export. And of course, the internet's global, so people would, signing an email, right, and distributing the software was considered, there was a limitation on distributing software. So what this guy did is he published it in a book and used the United States law of free speech to give himself, carve out a safe harbor for himself. So he had to ship the code as a book. But that was interesting because now that people don't have to deal with that anymore. But back then they did. And yeah, so I just wanted to put that out there, that the encryption is another thing on the free speech side. I just wanted to broaden this because the government is afraid that once you, and societies are afraid that once you encrypt communication, you could put anything there. You can put billions of dollars in money going over the wire. You could put instructions to organize a terror operation or anything else, demands for kidnapping, ransom, whatever. And so they're afraid of encryption. And of course, there could be uses like that. But then there is also positives. Sorry, go ahead. There's so much that I would ask, but I wanted to ask where you stand on encryption and where you stand on end-to-end encryption besides decentralization.
Well, you're absolutely right. I mean, I can remember in the 90s, yeah, they had all of these export controls on encryption, and as you said, they literally they treated it like munitions. So sending somebody a small piece of software was treated like was treated like you were sending them guns or bullets or something like that, which is kind of absurd. Well, both in hindsight, and it was fairly apparent that it was absurd back then. But I think quickly there was a recognition that I'm not sure exactly when it happened. I think in the late 90s maybe. They kind of relaxed those regulations and they kind of went away. But yeah, PGP was definitely a canary in the coal mine with encryption technology, and the PGP is kind of an interesting case study for another reason, because it never really caught on outside kind of crypto hobbyist type circles. And I think the reason for that was it was just kind of difficult to use. And that has been true. This kind of gets similar to the problem with decentralization, which is often decentralized systems are more difficult to use. And that's what they have a much more difficult time getting adopted, particularly just by non-technical users.
Yeah, there's just so much effort devoted to building the tech infrastructure that, like we said, they have less funding. You've talked about how you have a grant here and there, but also there's less resources left over to devote to beautiful, shiny interfaces and marketing and branding. Probably that's the case. Most open source software, like you said, where open source software is deployed, eventually it takes over. Nginx web server, Apache web server. Most of the web runs on those rather than Internet Information Server of Microsoft. Same thing, Wikipedia versus Encarta, right? Encarta or Britannica. That was a great encyclopedia, but these days nobody almost reads it. It's a rounding error compared to Wikipedia, and so on. We've got Linux running, like you said, all the Androids, the Macs are built on an operating system that resembles BSD. It might even be open sourced to some extent. So everything that's been open source, including the web, has unlocked so much potential. And of course, with Web3, almost everything's open source because it's decentralized, because everyone's got to run the same code. So you might as well make the code available. And so we've got Ethereum and others leading to an explosion. The Web3 is like the Web1 explosion, which is to say, everything's open source. You can read the source of any smart contract or anything, just like you could read HTML here. And so hobbyists, people can just pick it up. And there's so many people, probably the web is the most widely deployed platform and has the most developers. And I think that's the case with Ethereum and some of these things is going to be the case. So yeah, open source is where it's able to take hold of the crowd working together. It takes over. But yeah,
and there is a little bit of a paradox there, because while if you think about the let's say take the World Wide Web as kind of a stack, you've got kind of on the client side, you've got the web browser. That's all kind of largely open source technology. Really since Netscape open sourced Mozilla way back in the day. And then on the server side, a lot of the server side stacks are open source as well. Most web servers are open source. Mostly it runs on Linux. However, it's not really open because all of this open source software is running on hardware that's sitting in data centers that are, of course, centrally controlled. And so one of the ways that I think about what we're trying to do with Locutus is replace that kind of centralized infrastructure part of the stack with something that's completely decentralized, such that now the internet infrastructure at least has the potential to be entirely decentralized.
So I want to delve into that. I want to now move to the technology part and the stack that you're talking about, because that's absolutely right. Not many people know that the geeks and the nerds shape the world these days. You know, everyone's using the iPhone, right? Well, it was designed by people who designed touchscreens. I remember people from NYU and these professors, they had the multi-touch, and then Apple came out with a miniaturized multi-touch, and then all of a sudden everyone's like, wow, I'm addicted to my phone. They're also addicted because of the internet stack. You know, before the internet, people were like, this is for doing my homework, right? And office work and playing video games. And then all of a sudden video games are networked and people are online and they're addicted. People went from not touching computers, thinking they're nerdy things, to addicted. And it took time, and people, the nerds built that, right? The geeks built that. So I want to talk about the tech. And, you know, I've been a proponent for a very long time of decentralization. There's two types. There's at least two types, okay? There's the type where there's still servers. There are still, you know, privileged machines, but you can, the software is given to everybody. So like you said, everyone's running in a data center. Well, you can run it out of your house. You could have a social network for your buildings, right? You could have a village with no internet, very bad internet. And instead of Google Loon or Facebook drones or some corporate sponsored thing from the United States, you could plan dinner, you can date, you can make doctor's appointments, you could do everything locally without having to use anyone else's servers. To do that, you don't need the decentralization that you're talking about, the Locutus one, which we'll get into right now after this. You need almost like a copy of what they do at Facebook, but just on a smaller scale and given to everybody to easily install. And so I remember talking to the lawyer for the Freedom Foundation. Oh, I forgot his name. That guy's a character. Eben Moglen. Okay. So he was up in New York by the Juilliard School and like the Lincoln Center. And he was, you know, working with Richard Stallman. He worked on the Freedom Box. I don't know what happened with that. The Freedom Box was just loaded with like open source software that you can install in your, you know, your servers and your thing. So that's one type of decentralization. That's the type of decentralization I'm talking about here on Cointelegraph, and, you know, Tim Berners-Lee and other people who are Web 2 people. They talk about this. Hey, why don't we have our own software? We run it on our own computers and our own systems, right? My own data can be run on my computers that I trust that are in my apartment or whatever. And if you want my data, or you want me to show it back to me using my own server, I don't need you to have my data, right? So that's one. The other type of decentralization is where essentially you need the internet. It's not about having a local area network and having a privileged server on it. Instead, you have a wider internet, but the internet could be patchy. You could have like one uplink. So in Ukraine, if the internet is destroyed, or during Egypt, you know, they shut down the internet, there could be one satellite somewhere, and a little bit of information like the latest state of the blockchain could be transmitted. And so when that is the case, you've got these decentralized protocols, right, that run globally. Filecoin runs globally. And so it's a different type of decentralization. So one type helps you to plan locally, date locally, get things done locally without depending on some capitalist organization in the United States. And the other is a protocol that is resilient and cannot be taken down by anyone. So you're talking about the second type.
Yes, I think so. I mean, one way I think about it is that you have what are maybe called federated protocols, and probably the earliest and best known of those is email. In that, if you wanted to, you could run a web server, an email server on your computer at home, and you know, receive email on that. So I kind of almost think of that as being kind of halfway to being decentralized. The issue with federated systems is that you still need a discovery mechanism. So if you were running an email server on your computer at home, other email servers would still be able to they'd need to be able to find it in order to send you email. And so typically they would rely on the domain name system for that, which is, it's a centralized system in that it is centrally controlled, although it's also kind of federated in that responsibility is delegated down to kind of lower level parts of the DNS system.
Right, they're controlled by a consortium called International Consortium for Assigned Names and Numbers, ICANN. And I guess I wonder if it's, you know, I can do this or I can do that. But
you
yes,
can do it, anyone can.
you do whatever you want. But I think there are about 7 people that control the keys to the thing, and there's some kind of ceremony that they have when they need to come together and affect change. But clearly that is centralized in the hands of those people. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And so to me, the kind of the ultimate system would be something which is what completely decentralized, that solved the discovery problem. So you don't need to rely on something like DNS, which is centrally controlled for discovery, and which is also capable of supporting the big things that people use the internet for today, which would be whether it's group chat or instant messaging, one-on-one chat, or whether it's microblogging, which would be kind of Facebook, Twitter, that kind of use case. So to me, the holy grail is a system that makes it easy to build entirely decentralized alternatives to those kind of big use cases for the internet today.
So for the next 10 minutes, I want to kind of rapid fire ask you questions about Locutus and about Freenet, and just ask about the technology of it. The first thing you would want to do is routing. You, like you said, want to find where is the data live, okay? So if I make a request for some data, or I want to connect to some group activity, which is what we do at Intercloud or Intercoin, and you're doing with Locutus, which is to say data that evolves with time, like a chat room or Google Wave. They used to have these, you know, evolving with time thing. I want to know where the data is. So like you said, you could go with DNS, you could go with federated systems. The alternative is something which is called like content addressable systems, right? You got a content of a file, you get the hash. And so how do you find it? I've been speaking to people like Petar Maimonkov, who invented Kademlia, but that was after Freenet came out. That was like 2004 or 2002 that they published it. So what did Freenet use? Did it flood the system like Kazaa with like everyone stores every routing table? Like what exactly, how did people find things on Freenet?
That's a great question. So Freenet relies, and in fact Locutus as well, relies on something called small world networks, which it's related to Kademlia. Kademlia will be a distributed hash table, it's called.
Right.
And so there was kind of a weird thing around that time. It was almost kind of independent reinvention of the same idea or a similar idea. So a small world network is also it's also inspired by nature. In fact, like that's kind of getting back to emergent systems that I was interested in. And the term small world network comes from something most people would be familiar with, the 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon, the observation that you can get from Kevin Bacon to any other actor in 6 or less steps just by looking at the movies they'd appeared in together. And that idea, that 6 degrees idea, dates back, at least to my knowledge, to the 1960s, to an experiment run by Stanley Milgram, who's a famous researcher back then. And his experiment So he actually, there are a lot of experiments he's famous for. One of which you're looking at now, which is his shock experiment. But the experiment, yeah, the Stanford prison experiment is another one. But the experiment he did relevant to small world networks is he went out, he got a bunch of letters, hundreds of letters, and he wrote the addresses of people, I think it was in Boston, Massachusetts, on each of these letters. And then he went all around the country and he gave the letter to just random people. And he told those people, okay, your job is to get this letter to this person, but you can only do it by sending it to somebody that you know personally. And they have to send it to somebody who they know personally, and so on. And what he discovered was that not all of the letters made it, some of them got lost, but of the ones that made it, they were able to navigate this kind of social graph of everyone in the United States, and they were able to get the letter to its destination in 6 steps. I think the median number of steps was 6 steps. So that's where this idea of 6 degrees of separation comes from, is from his experiment. And so the question is, well, why is it possible to do that? Like, why is it possible that I can get a letter, I can say, okay, well, I don't know this person, but I see they're in Boston. My uncle lives in Boston. I'll send it to him. So just following that algorithm, you're able to route through a network to find a destination quite efficiently. And there was research done in around about the same time that we were working on Freenet that demonstrated what kind of network is possible to navigate in this way, where you can get from one part of it to another part of it quite efficiently. And it turns out that human relationships form that type of network for the simple reason that you're more likely to know people that live close to you than you are to know people who are much more distant. And so the trick that Freenet uses and Locutus uses is that peers that are participating in the network will self-organize into a small world network. So if you ask your peer, hey, go find me this document, your peer will look at that and say, well, I don't have it. Which other peer am I connected to is most likely to have this document?
That's in 2022. Do you use Kademlia, or what kind of distributed hash table technology are you planning to use?
Well, we're building our own based on this small world network idea. So essentially we're reusing the approach taken by Freenet. So in effect, it's the custom distributed hash table.
Okay, great. By the way, in about 8 to 10 minutes, when we jump on the second half, the Telegram, I want to ask kind of with everybody, I want to tie it into what we're talking about. But here, I want to ask about, okay, we have the technology, you have a bunny over here, right? The rabbit. That would suggest that it's fast. In my experience, or at least not my experience, but the comments that people say about distributed hash tables is like it takes like 20 seconds or something for the signal to bounce around before you find something. So compared to this federated systems like DNS, that's an eternity. Would you rather have a tortoise? I'm joking, but what is the idea of the hare and the rabbit here if you're using a decentralized search?
Oh, well, I guess to answer your question, yes, it is true that DHTs can be slow, but I don't think they have to be slow. And so our goal with Locutus is that you will, let's say if you're using it for instant messaging, your message will arrive within about a second, which I think is kind of acceptable, fairly acceptable for that kind of use case. So they don't have to be slow. We've learned a lot with Freenet about how to make it faster over the years, and we're incorporating a lot of those lessons into Locutus, and Locutus we're really designing from the ground up to be very, very efficient. So it's probably not going to be, I don't think it's ever going to be as fast as visiting the Google homepage and it loads within 50 milliseconds, because Google hardware is everywhere. But we think it will be more than fast enough for a lot of the use cases that people want to use it for. The rabbit logo is a little bit of a play on words. There's a concept within Freenet called hops to live, which is, it relates to when you send a message. We don't want messages bouncing around the network for eternity, so we give each message a lifespan. We call that hops to live, and we then came up with the idea of a rabbit called hops to live, and so that comes from.
I'm going to ask a lot more on the show about this. Also, we talk about the scarcity, because obviously there's scarce resources. You can't store everything. And so Freenet had a very interesting thing where least recently accessed content was eventually discarded in favor of more stuff. And when we talk about cryptocurrency now and paying for storage, it becomes very interesting. I've had a lot of debates with the people at MadeSafe. So just really quick background. It seems that Scotland is a hotbed for innovation in decentralized systems. This team from MadeSafe has been working since 2004 on building something that is beyond IPFS, Tor, and other things. I like to think of it as until I heard about Locutus, I was thinking of it as like Freenet 2.0. In that they take a piece of data, they split it into 3 parts at least, and then they encrypt everything. They invented something called self-encryption, which they patented. It was their only patent, and they just plan to defensively use it or something. But the idea is then they use Kademlia, I think DHT, to store it. But then they have all these innovations about how there's consensus and how the data evolves with time, which is why later on offline we could continue. They have a forum. We have a forum with Intercloud. And so there's a lot of interest in building this, but they're out of Scotland. They're in Ayr, Scotland. And I've spoken to them. So one of the things that I've always been sort of debating with them is who pays for storage, okay? And we have articles on our forum, which I wrote, who pays for storage? Take NFTs, who pays for storage? And we're going to talk about that on the show because we talk about NFTs. So I'm going to defer that. But the idea that the least recently used approach they used in Freenet is very simple and it's very straightforward. And today, people might want to store things for years, even though it's accessed very little. And that's always the question. If you have a big pocketbook and you just want to do that, can you do that? And maybe that info is very valuable. Maybe it's accessed very, very rarely, but it's very valuable when it is accessed. So there's that. But with the routing, you're saying you've created your own custom system and you're sticking with it today. And I would be very surprised if that system is so quick. Then remember we said decentralized is almost like clunky in the sense that in many ways, visually and so on. But one of the ways that people expect is the speed. They expect things to be fast these days. They're spoiled. I would argue a lot of the times the speed is an anti-pattern. The Slack chats come in, blah, 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 you can't do your work, and almost like long form, thoughtful, threaded conversations are more conducive to like thinking things through rather than 40 characters. So a lot of our societies become fast, fast, fast. I'm okay with slow, but I think it doesn't hit that consumer pleasure mode that, so I think if you have something that's fast, the routing is fast, that's a major feature for these days.
Yeah, and that was very much like Locutus is really the accumulation of a lot of what I've learned over the 20 years since we started Freenet. The ability to do fast real-time communication is key. That's one of our key design goals with Locutus. Yeah, as I said, I think our goal is that it should be responsive enough for relatively real-time communication, like with IM. I agree with you about the kind of interruptive nature of Slack, and how maybe there are some behavioral changes that would make things better for everyone, but we're not trying to solve every problem at once, and so we're trying to work within people's behavior today, and support kind of people's expectations of speed and efficiency today. One of the other things we learned with Freenet is that it uses a decent amount of bandwidth. It kind of assumes a broadband connection. It kind of assumes the bandwidth is very flexible, is virtually free. And we learned that really doesn't work. If you're in China, for example, you're paying per megabyte or per gigabyte, and excessive bandwidth usage can be a real disincentive. So one of our other goals with Locutus was really to make it very, very efficient with bandwidth usage for those who need that.
Absolutely. So we're going to go to the interactive section in a few minutes. And I just wanted to say, I think, like I said, because we're embedded in a market economy with consumer tastes always evolving, and sometimes getting addicted to things which I believe are harmful to society, like tweets at 5 a.m. that reach 5 million people unfiltered, or like arguing toxically about, politics or things like this. The media almost distracts us with, the lock-in that they have with their audience. But whatever that is, we're embedded in that system. And so in a system where people valued thoughtful discussion and threaded discussion, you almost wouldn't have to optimize for speed, because you send off that email and you don't, it's like a letter. People used to write letters to each other and they would put thought into it. And so you don't expect a reply 2 seconds later, but in the world we live today, it's almost like you need to optimize, you need to spend all these resources to optimize for that, even though it may not be helpful to society to do that. And you could save all that time and money to do something else, but it's just the way it is. Right. So, all right, Ian Clarke. So for people listening, this is going to be a video that's posted on YouTube. And the second half is also video. It's recorded live on YouTube. And so we're going to have an audience and questions. And some people have seen this, some people have not. So I'm going to reintroduce you. And we go from there.
Okay. And we're doing this on Telegram?
On Telegram. Yeah. Great. All right. I'll see you there.
If you want to see more videos like this, click subscribe and then remember to click the little bell icon so you get notifications. Intercoin, making crypto mainstream.